honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands is up next. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est un honneur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my honor to rise to speak today. I am standing on the unceded lands of the Indigenous people, namely the Anishinaabe. We are standing on Algonquin land.
Do so on behalf of my constituents from Saanich Gulf Islands. Today we are taking up the legislative interpretation, Bill C32, of the Minister of Finance's Fall Economic Statement as tabled November 4th. I do want to start with the things I like about this bill. I want to be clear that I'll be voting in favor of Bill C32. I will be bringing forward amendments, assuming this bill gets through second reading and we see it at committee, which I think is a foregone conclusion. In any case, the aspects of this bill, although it's primarily focused in its substance on a number of promises that have to do with making housing more affordable, with reducing speculation in the residential housing market, such things as really substantial measures that I'm pleased to see to discourage flipping of real estate properties, first-time homebuyers opportunities, first-time homebuyers tax credit is being substantially increased. We're seeing cuts on interest rates on student loans. We're seeing a number of measures that one could generally categorize as making life more affordable. And I'm pleased to see those measures. Clearly, there are things in this bill that are long overdue. I'm also pleased on facing the climate crisis. There is very little, but one good measure is phasing out the flow-through shares for oil, gas, and coal activities. In other words, stopping one of the many tax advantages offered to fossil fuels. But there's a lot to discuss that flows from the Fall Economic Statement that isn't in the legislation. And with your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, I want to concentrate more on what's missing than what's here. I want to read from the Fall Economic Statement, if I may. So quoting the Minister, Honourable Minister for Finance and Deputy Prime Minister, in the introductory statements before we get into the substantial parts of the statement. She calls for a green transition and then says, quote, this requires, quote, an industrial transformation comparable in scale only to the Industrial Revolution itself, close quote. Now, I completely agree with that. I would say perhaps it's an industrial transformation that's quite comparable to what Canada's economy went through in the Second World War. This is not incremental steps. This is fundamental and transformational, and that is what's required. The Honourable Minister put this forward in connection with a 1903 quote from Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, who said in this very place, or at least in this place when it was in Centre Block, that we can't wait for transformation. He was referring to building a transcontinental railway, and that this transformation will change, quote, the conditions of our national life, which we would be folly to ignore and a crime to overlook. I agree with all those words, but the ambition embedded in those words is completely lacking in C32. So looking ahead to the spring budget and identifying what's missing, I want to reflect a bit on the timing, the urgency, and what I hope to see, and what all Canadians should put pressure on this government to deliver by spring. In contrast, looking to the south of the border, it's very interesting to me that President Joe Biden managed to get through a very ambitious climate plan, but the heading of the bill is the Inflation Reduction Act. So the target is inflation, and it will in fact reduce inflation, but the measures are ambitious climate-related measures which Canada has not yet undertaken. But also the U.S., of course, must do more as well. As we stand here today, those are of our delegates and friends from this chamber, my friend from Kitchener Centre, the Minister of Environment, are at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where they just decided to extend the meeting that was slated to adjourn today. It is extended until midnight tomorrow. Progress has not been made. We are running out of time, quite literally. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has opened COP27 by saying that the world was on a highway to climate hell, foot on the accelerator. we have an obligation not to allow our children and grandchildren to live in climate hell. Yet everything we've done so far as a nation falls dramatically short of what's required to meet our obligations under the science and under our international obligations to attempt to hold to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming and to stay as far below 2 degrees as possible. It's getting really impossible, even for an optimist like myself, to imagine that we can hold to 1.5 degrees. We're on track to nearly double that. But let's look at what we would do if we were serious. And I start by looking at what should be in the next in the next budget, and what this government should do, because it's not too late. It's desperately close to too late, but it's not too late. On doit arrêter la croissance dans les émissions de gaz à effet.
We need to stop increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, it's not possible to hit the targets that were set in the Paris Accords when growing the rate of greenhouse gas emissions. We must act quickly and accept the idea that the era of fossil fuels is almost ended.
Accept that our dependency on fossil fuels must end, and soon. So it was very disappointing to read that at COP27, within the last 24 hours, Canada rejected the language that we had accepted in Glasgow last year, that we're working towards the phase out of coal. Most countries were prepared to say, let's say coal and oil and gas, many of our allies. Canada said, oh, we can't say we're going to phase out oil and gas on any timeline. Come on. 2 weeks from now, of course, we can't do that in 2 weeks. 10 years? Probably not. But the goal must be to phase out all fossil fuels, or we are indeed headed on the highway to climate hell. When Sir Wilfrid Laurier talked about linking the country east to west with a railway, what's the modern climate equivalent of that? An east-west electricity grid. The ability to have 100% renewable sourced electricity must be able to flow from one province to the other, north to the territories. Right now, our provincial monopolistic utilities only want to sell one way, south. And they sell south for their profits. If it's good, fine. But the grid can operate like the giant battery we really need. Let's look at where we would be if we considered the links between inflation and climate action. I think that's an important place to start. We need to stop thinking in silos, in other words, and start thinking holistically. And a light bulb went off for me. Recently, I was talking to a friend who's an Alberta grain farmer, and I asked how they had survived the very brutal drought. His answer was, well, it would have been really bad because we were only able to take in, we planted barley, we only got in about half the crop we would have gotten in a normal year without the extreme drought. But because of the war in Ukraine, the price of grain was so high that in the end, we kind of had a good year. What does that say? That means that when Canadian consumers are looking at increased prices for pasta, increased prices for bread products, it's a combination of things that have nothing to do with demand-driven inflation as we had in the early 1970s. Food costs are going to keep going up because the climate crisis will continue to interrupt the growing seasons, will continue to deliver what we had for a lot of farmers and livestock producers in southern British Columbia. Atmospheric rivers killed tens of thousands of animals, chickens mostly. We have droughts that mean farmers can't plant crops and have a good return. That's a real cost increase. It's not about spending by the government that drives up inflation because it's demand-driven by people needing more wages. This is real cost increases. Now, that means we have to also be prepared for extreme weather events, and we're not. The government has postponed the delivery of the adaptation strategy to next year. And yesterday, the Auditor General told us that in the case of First Nations communities, 112 approved infrastructure grants that would help First Nations and other Indigenous communities prepare for extreme weather events were not funded by the department, just through pure delays. There is much to be done in this country to take us from laggard, where we, as many people know, this week rated among the worst performing industrialized countries on climate. We could still propel ourselves to leader. we could take care of our farmers, our agriculture, our economic future, and ensure our kids live in a livable, hospitable world. We have an obligation to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there's many things in which I could make reference to with regards to the fall economic statement, but I'm very much curious in terms of what the Green Party's position, more specifically what the member's position is in regards to nuclear power. Does she feel that there is a role for nuclear power in Canada?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to parse the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary's question a bit more by saying, no, there's no case for new nuclear installations in order to avoid climate hell. There is a case for maintaining existing operating reactors and phasing them out when they come to the end of their natural lifespan. But when you examine, and I do encourage everyone in this place to examine energy alternatives by a couple of firm criteria, such as for dollar invested, how many tons of carbon are eliminated, for dollar invested, how many jobs are created, and how long from the moment you decide to say yes and give it an approval before you see energy flow from that development. Even excluding the unsolved problem of nuclear waste, the link to nuclear proliferation in the military, and the risk of accidents, put that all to the side and say, okay, we're prepared to believe that we'll escape all those problems. It doesn't make economic sense to go nuclear.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank my colleague for a very good speech here. I do know that my colleague is very much focused on demonizing the oil and gas industry, and she focused her initial comments were on the reversal of flow-through funds, so-called Canadian development expenses, Canadian exploration expenses, which she should acknowledge, I think, in her response here, were actually disposed of by this government several years ago, and all they're doing is fast-tracking the undeployment of those funds. So really, a very small amount here. And I wonder if she can actually tell this House how small a portion of this fall economic statement that is, and it's already been baked in by every industry across Canada.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable colleague. He nailed it. The reality is that this fall economic statement does virtually nothing new on climate at all.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Longueuil-Saint-Hubert.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. I know she's very concerned about climate change. I'd like to know whether she shares my frustration in this place about the fight that's not happening, the debate that's not happening. We know the Conservatives aren't interested in combating climate change, so they have no plan. The Liberals aren't very interested in it either, but they pretend to have a plan. They talk about $8.5 billion US that they're investing and so on. But meanwhile, GHG emissions have gone up ever since the Liberals took office. But there's a lot of rhetoric. They make these big speeches and announcements and promises and so on. So we're kind of stuck. There are members here who aren't interested at all and have no solutions. Does my colleague have any ideas how to solve this problem? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. I'd like to thank my colleague from the Bloc Québécois. That's absolutely true, but what I can say is I think there are a number of members here in this place who have individual capacities as human beings, and they believe that we're in a crisis and that it's unacceptable to even think about continuing to go on with the Conservatives' denial policies and the Liberals' policies. And the Conference of the Parties said that we only have until 2025 to reach 1.5 or 2% degrees, 1.5 or 2 degrees rather. And otherwise, we risk eliminating the human civilization. Questions and comments?
In Strathcona. Edmonton, Strathcona.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you, Mr. Speaker. I think maybe the translation didn't catch up in time. Sorry about that. Well, I would like to thank my colleague for her intervention. That was very interesting for me. And I do notice that she is wearing a Sustainable Development Goal pin. One of the things that I find most frustrating is that we have a government that claims that we have a feminist international assistance policy. We have a government who speaks about being a feminist government, about perhaps one day providing a feminist foreign policy. And yet we know the impacts on women and girls from climate change around the world are deeply disparate. Can she talk a little bit about those impacts and ways that Canada and the Canadian government could do more to protect those who are most vulnerable, women and girls around the world?
Of course, we are out of time, but I will allow the member to answer. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable colleague from Edmonton Strathcona. Even though this is not a climate impact, my thoughts are ever with the women inside Afghanistan who are at risk from the Taliban, including some prominent feminists we need to help. I'll also say that obviously in any society, when things are desperate, whether through war such as in Ukraine or through extreme drought or through things like Hurricane Fiona, it is the women as generally less economically empowered than the men in countries around the world, women who take care of their parents and their children, who face the impact, and women are the majority of farmers around the world. All of those impacts from climate crisis particularly affect women.